over the years, I think there's been a kind of a dominant notion about aging, a kind of a general hypothesis about the nature of aging, which has dominated thought about biology of aging and guided experimental approaches and hypothesis generation and so on. And this is the idea that that living organisms are complex systems, and like other complex systems in the non-living world, like machinery and so on, they wear out over time. Complex things wear out, and when you look at a person, animals, when they become senescent, it kind of looks like they've worn out. And so with the development of modern biochemistry and molecular biology, and the kind of tendency to look for ultimate answers at the molecular level, there arose this notion that maybe aging was the result of a kind of wear and tear at the level of molecular processes, so molecular damage. And there are many different theories about molecular damage as a cause of aging, but most of them share this notion that it's random damage, sort of random wear and tear of molecules. So this led to a focus on what might be causing damage to accumulate over age, and what's the nature of damage that accumulates with aging. In terms of the latter, evidence for the idea of aging as a damage accumulation process came quite early on, because if you look at proteins, at DNA, at lipids in lab animals or in humans as they get older, you see damage accumulating. You see DNA damage, protein oxidation and so on accumulates. So for several decades, one particular idea became very prominent, which was the idea that it's actually living in an oxidizing environment, which is a major driver of aging. So the notion was that the body simply couldn't escape the accumulation of oxidative damage. So this would accumulate, and then it would be the cause of the various diseases of aging. This theory then was tested extensively over about 20 years, particularly in the 90s and then in the noughties. And during the 90s, I think towards the end of the 90s, there was a very strong sort of confidence in the theory, and particularly in the notion that if you could manipulate the defenses against oxidative damage and against free radical damage, you could alter the aging rate, and you could actually protect against aging. So, and still up to now, if you go into health food shops, you'll find antioxidant supplements, and you can buy sort of superoxide dismutase capsules and things like this as treatments for aging. But what happened during the noughties was increasingly rigorous tests of this oxidative damage theory using these short-lived animal models, so using C. elegans, the worm, using Drosophila fruit flies, also in mice, feeding them antioxidants in the diet, or manipulating them genetically to enhance their intrinsic resistance to oxidative damage and to give them extra capacity to detoxify oxidizing species within the cell. And the balance of that evidence from that research clearly came down against the theory. My own lab, we spent probably 10 years, not full time, but on and off 10 years, testing this theory in C. elegans, using all sorts of different approaches, and it's just not correct. So I think that at the moment, I think in a way, the nature of the state of the field is kind of strange. I think that there is still a lot of interest in the notion of damage as a primary cause, but I think partly because of the problems with this oxidative damage theory, there's almost been a flight away from theory, a flight away from the idea that you can identify primary causes, and a tendency to say, oh well, you can't find a cause of aging. There are so many different things going on, and it's a bit naive really to say what is the cause of aging. And I think there's something to that, but I think that it's also too easy to do that. It's running away from the challenge. The challenge is to say, can you define some fundamental causes of aging in some form? And I think you could argue that the question of, what's the cause of aging, it's a little similar to the question, what's the cause of disease? So you could say that sort of disease not to do with aging, the normal diseases, that younger people get. So you could say, well, that's a silly question. There is no cause of disease. But I think that you can answer this question. You can say, well, okay, what causes disease? There are many things, but there are certain classes of cause. You could say, well, there are a lot of diseases are caused by infectious pathogens. You have bacteria, viruses, macroparasites. That's one type of cause of disease, and that links through to the germ theory of disease. And then you have hereditary diseases, genetic diseases that you inherit, congenital diseases of abnormal development. There are diseases that are caused by mechanical injury. There are a limited number of major categories of cause of disease, and that gives a general understanding of the nature of disease. And I would argue that that's what we need for aging. We need to be able to try, in a way this is perhaps an aspiration, that we can identify some fundamental basic causes, and it's some sort of combination of those broad causes that gives an understanding of aging, and that's what we lack at the moment. So there is a recent theory which I think in a way provides something as an alternative or in addition to the idea of aging as a damage process, which is an idea that has arisen over the last decade or so. And this is based in an old idea from an evolutionary biologist, an American called George Williams. And it is an evolutionary genetic theory, which argues that, that aging is actually something which is very much controlled through your genome. It's not something so much that happens to you, it's something that your genes enact and make happen. So it's coming from within, in a way. And that what happens when aging evolves is that you may have genes which produce beneficial effects when you're young, but the same gene, through its action, may cause pathology when you're older. And natural selection cares much more about what happens when you're young. Natural selection is essentially, or fitness, evolutionary fitness, is really a matter of being able to develop to reproductive maturity and have offspring and to reproduce successfully. After you've reproduced successfully, the force of natural selection is actually declining. So if you have a new gene, a new version of a gene that enhances your fitness when you're younger, enables you to have more offspring, but the same gene is having harmful effects much later in life, it may be that natural selection favors that new gene, even though it's causing aging. So one of the things that was a limitation, if you like, of this theory, which is sometimes called the antagonistic pleiotropy theory. So that comes from the word pleiotropy, which is where a change in a gene is having multiple effects. So antagonistic pleiotropy means that it's having good and bad effects from the same change, but the good effects in the aging theory happen early and the bad effects later. So in a way, the problem with the antagonistic pleiotropy theory over the years was that it doesn't really tell you at the level of mechanism what's actually happening to the cell. It's kind of an abstract idea. But then in the naughties, there was a sort of one particular biologist guy called Misha Blagoskloin. He's actually a Russian guy working in the States, who came up with a way to reconcile a lot of recent discoveries in the biology of aging with antagonistic pleiotropy theory into a kind of a new theory, which sometimes is called the hyperfunction theory. So what this theory argues is that you can have antagonistic pleiotropy in genes affecting entire programs of cellular differentiation and change. So these can be developmental programs, they can be reproductive programs, they could be programs of tissue regeneration and wound healing and remodeling and so on. And that actually run-on of these programs or activation of these programs in later life is actually, it can explain a lot of the pathologies that you see in later life. So this new theory is a theory that we've been testing in my lab, and it's turned out to be very, very powerful in terms of explaining the origins of disease, of aging-related disease in C. elegans. So what this theory is really saying in terms of its broad meaning is that the cause of aging is actually your own genes. And it's not because the genes are defective, it's not because of a failure of gene function or mutations of normal genes. It's actually the good genes, the wild-type genes, which are actually generating through their continued action in later life, late life pathologies. So this is very exciting. And I think this is not to say that this is a theory that explains the entire aging process, but I think at the moment it looks to me from the studies of the worm that this is one of the major principles, if you like, which is explaining where aging-related diseases are coming from. So I think this has been a really interesting development in biogerontology in recent years.